In this video, you'll learn how to make this form in HTML. Then, how to write the PHP code to safely insert the data from this form into a MySQL database. Let's start by creating a new file called form.html. In here, we start with the doc type, which tells the browser that the code that follows will be valid HTML. Then we'll add an HTML tag, and inside here, head and body tags. Inside the head tag, we'll add a title and a meta tag specifying the character set of this document as UTF-8. This will allow us to use characters from non-English alphabets with no problems. In the body, let's just add a level 1 header element. Before we go any further, let's just make sure this works in the browser. If I specify that file name at the local host address, we see the content from the HTML file. Now we can add the form. Inside the body, let's add a form element. Inside this, we'll add an input element with a type attribute that has a value of text. Before this, we'll put some text so the user knows what to type in the input. In the browser, this shows a simple text input in which we can enter some text. Note how the text before the input is just text. Let's surround this text with a label element. This won't affect how the text looks, but it does affect how it works. We associate this label with an input by adding an ID attribute to the input, then a for attribute to the label, specifying the value as the ID of the input we want to associate this label with. In the browser, as we can see, nothing has changed visually. Now, however, if I click on the label text, the input focus is placed on the text input, and we can start typing. In addition to this, associating a label to an input like this makes the form more accessible for those visitors that are using assistive technologies like screen readers. Let's add another input control to the form. Let's add a Textarea element and give this an ID and associated label. In the browser, there's the Textarea. Note how a text input only allows one line of text, whereas a text area allows multiple lines. Also note that this isn't an input element with a type of text area. It's a text area element, and unlike an input element, you have to have the opening and closing tags. Before we add more inputs to the form, let's add some styling so that it's easier to see what's going on. Styling with CSS is beyond the scope of this video, but a quick way to add styles when developing a form is to use an existing CSS framework. Some of these, like Bootstrap for example, require you to add container elements and classes to your HTML so that the styles are applied. However, an even faster way of styling a form, so you can concentrate on the functionality, is to use some classless CSS. There are many of these available, for example water.css. The simplest way to use this is to include the style sheet directly from a CDN. So we'll copy this line of code and paste it inside the head element of the HTML. Now in the browser, the form has some nice styling without us having to add any classes. Next, let's add a list control where the user can pick from a predefined list of values. We'll add a select element and an associated label. Each item inside the list is an option element. Let's add 3 options: low, medium, and high. Like this, when the form is submitted, the value for this control will be the text of the selected option. Alternatively, if we add value attributes to the option elements, This is the value that will be submitted, not the text. This is the recommended way to do it, as the text is just a label. In the browser, the select element is shown as a drop-down list, where you can choose one of the supplied options. Note that when the page is first loaded, the first option is selected by default. You can change this default by adding the selected attribute to the relevant option. For example, let's add it to the second option. Now in the browser, the second option is selected by default. So if this isn't changed, this is the value that will be sent when the form is submitted. Next, let's add some radio buttons. A radio button is an input element with the type radio. To add a label, instead of adding this as a separate element, we can enclose the input and the text inside the label. Doing it this way means the label doesn't need a for attribute. Let's add another radio input in the same way just after this one. In the browser, there are the two radio buttons, and to select them, you can click on the radio button itself or the text. Note how once they're selected though, you can't unselect them. To make these into a group of controls where you can only select one, we add the name attribute to both input elements, specifying the same value for each. While we're here, let's also add a value attribute to each input. As with the select control, this is the value that will be sent when the form is submitted. Now in the browser, when we select one option, the others are unselected. In a group of radio buttons like this, only one option can be selected at once. Note that when the page is first loaded, there is no option selected by default. To select an option by default, we add the checked attribute to one of the input elements. Now when the form is displayed for the first time, that option is already selected. To add a label to this group of controls, we can't use a label element as we're using one for each option. Instead, we enclose them in a Fieldset element, then add a legend element inside that. Let's also add a line break element between the input elements, so each input is shown on a separate line. In the browser, the radio inputs are now surrounded by a line, with the text from the legend element shown at the top, with the radio buttons now on separate lines. Note that with a select list, you can have as many options as you like, as the list will use scroll bars if the list is long. Radio buttons, however, are best suited to a limited number of options, as they are always visible on the form. Next, let's add a checkbox control. A checkbox is an input element with a type of checkbox. To add a label to this, let's do it in the same way that we did with the radio buttons, enclosing the input and the label text inside a label element. In the browser, there's the checkbox. We can check and uncheck it by clicking on the box itself or on the text of the label. Finally, on the form, let's add a button to submit it. We'll add a button element, and I'll also put a line break element before this so the button is on a new line. In the browser, there's the button. Now we can add some code to process the form data when the form is submitted. Let's add a new file called processform.php. Back in the form, to make this form submit its data to this new file, we add an action attribute to the form element containing the URL to the location we want. As this file is in the same folder, we can just put the name of the file. Let's also add a method attribute specifying the post method. This means that the data from the form will be sent in the body of the request. If we don't specify this, the value will default to the get method, and the data will be sent in the URL, so it will be visible in the browser's history. Whenever you're saving the data from a form on the server, the form needs to use the post method. In the PHP script, let's add the PHP opening tag. The data from a post request will be in the post superglobal, so for now, let's just print that out. If I enter some data into the form and submit it, all we get printed out is an array with one element with an index of type and a value of 1. In the form, if we look at the various inputs, note that the only ones with name attributes are the radio buttons. Only inputs that have a name attribute will have their values sent when the form is submitted. So let's add name attributes to the other inputs. The text input, the text area, the select control, and the checkbox. Now if we refresh the page and submit the form, we see the values for all of the fields. Each array key comes from the name attribute of each input in the HTML, and its value is whatever was entered into the form. Next, in the PHP script, let's create a variable for each value we're interested in, taking the values from the post array using their indexes. Instead of printing out the post array, we'll use vardump to print out each of these variables. If we submit the form, we see the values of the variables. Watch what happens though if I submit the form without checking the checkbox. We get an undefined array key warning. This is because if a checkbox isn't checked, no value is sent in the form data for that control. So when we try to access an element of the post array with that index, we get the warning. There are several ways to fix this, for example checking to see if the index is set using the arrayKeyExists function, or the null coalesce operator to set this variable to a default value if the array key doesn't exist. Another way to do this is to use the filter input function with the Boolean validation filter. If the value is set, we'll get true, otherwise we'll just get null. So instead of getting the value from the post array directly, we'll call the filter input function, passing in the post input type constant, the index we want to check for, in this case terms, and the Boolean validation filter constant. So now if the checkbox is checked, we get Boolean true. If it's not checked, we no longer get a warning, we get null. Note how the values for the other controls are all strings. Even though these values are numbers, all values in the post array will be strings, as that's how the data is sent in the request. To get these as numbers, we can use the filter input function again. So for the priority variable, instead of getting the value from the post array, we'll call the filter input function, passing in the post constant, the index of the value we want, and this time we'll use the integer validation filter. We'll do the same for the type variable. Now when we submit the form, the values of these variables are integers. We're almost ready to insert this data into the database, but first we need to do a bit of validation. If we're using this checkbox to make sure the user has accepted some terms and conditions, we shouldn't continue if it isn't checked. As we just saw, as we're using the filter input function, The value of the terms variable will be true if the checkbox was checked and null otherwise. Null is the equivalent of Boolean false in a statement, so we can just check for it like this as the condition in an if statement. If the value isn't true, we'll stop the script with a suitable message. So if we submit the form without checking the checkbox, we get the message. If we check the checkbox, we get the variable values printed out as before. If you want to validate any of the other values, then here is where you would do it. Note that even if you add client-side validation in the browser, you still need to include the server-side validation, as client-side validation can be easily bypassed. Now we can insert this data into a database. First, let's create a database. I'll do this in phpMyAdmin. First, let's create a new database called MessageDB, accepting the default collation. Then, let's create a table called Message that has 5 columns. The first column will be called ID. It's an integer. We'll make it the primary key, and we'll check the auto increment checkbox so that the values for this column will be assigned automatically. Then, we'll call the next column Name, which is a 128 character varchar. Next, a column called Body for the body of the message, which will be text. Then a column for the priority, which is an integer, and one for the type, which is also an integer. Let's save that. And there's the database table. Now we can connect to this database from PHP. We no longer need to print out the data from the form, so we can remove this line. First, let's create some variables to contain the connection details for the database. The host is the same as the web server, localhost. The name of the database we just created is MessageDB, and we'll connect using the root account, which by default has a blank password. Note that connecting with the root account like this is only recommended when developing locally. To connect to the database, we call the MySQL connect function, passing in the host, username, password, and database name. These variables have to be in this order, and it's a common error to get them in the wrong order. If you prefer, you can use named arguments by prefixing each value with the name of the argument. If you do this, it doesn't matter which order they're in. This returns an object that represents the connection to the database, so we'll assign that to a variable. Before we can use this database connection, we need to make sure we connected OK. The MySQL connect error number function returns an error code from the most recent connection attempt. If there was no error, this returns 0. So we can check for this by simply using this as the condition for an if statement. If a connection error has occurred, we'll stop the script as above and print out a message. We can get a description of the error by calling the MySQL connect error function. If an error hasn't occurred, for now, let's print out a message saying the connection was successful. Let's give that a try. When we submit the form, we get the connection successful message. Let's see what happens if I get one of the connection details wrong. For example, let's change the password. Now if I submit the form, we get the connection error message, specifically access denied. This is what happens if the credentials are incorrect. Let's change this back so the details are correct again. Once we've successfully connected to the database, we can insert a new record. First, let's remove this connection successful message. Then, let's create a variable that will contain the SQL that we need. To insert a record, we use the INSERT INTO statement, specifying the name of the table, which is message, and in parentheses, a list of the columns that we're going to insert values into. We don't need to specify the ID column, as a value for this will be assigned automatically. Then we add the values keyword, followed by a list of the values we want to insert in parentheses. The values from the form are in the variables we created above. There are several ways we could include these in the SQL. We could insert the values of the variables directly like this, making sure that string values are enclosed in single quotes. However, doing it like this makes the code vulnerable to an SQL injection attack. An attacker could insert some SQL code by including single quote characters in the form data. There are several ways to avoid this, but the one that leaves us with the clearest SQL string is to use a prepared statement. To use a prepared statement, first, we replace the literal data values in the SQL string with question mark characters, which are known as placeholders. Note that we don't have to put quotes around the string values, just a question mark where the value will go. Next, we call the MySQL statement init function, passing in the connection as an argument to create a prepared statement object. Then we call the MySQL statement prepare function, passing in this object and the SQL string. This returns a Boolean success value, so let's check to see if this is false, and if so, we'll stop the script, printing out the error message as above. It's at this point that any syntax errors in the SQL will be caught. Now we can connect values to the placeholders in the SQL string, which is known as binding. To do this, we call the MySQL statement bindParam function. When we bind values to the placeholders, we specify a type for each variable, using a string of individual characters, where each character corresponds to one of the variables. The characters we can use are I for integer values, D for double values, S for strings, and B for blobs. So let's call the function, passing in the statement variable as the first parameter. The second parameter is the string of types. So in this case, it would be an S for the name, as it's a string, followed by another S for the body, then an I for the priority, as this is an integer, and finally another I for the type. The rest of the parameters are the values of these variables, so the name, message, priority, and type variables. The number of parameters has to match the number of characters in the string, otherwise an exception will be thrown. Once we've done this, to execute it, we call the MySQL statement execute function, passing in the statement object as an argument. Finally, let's print out a message saying the record has been saved. Let's give that a try. If I enter some values that contain single quote characters and submit the form, we see the record saved message. And in the database, there's the record containing the values from the form. Note that the value for the ID column has been assigned automatically. So this is the minimum PHP code you need to safely insert a database record with data from a form. This is covered in much more detail in the course linked to in the description below. Also in the description is a link to the code shown in this video, along with links to relevant documentation. Please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.